Now the M52 engine is in the bay, we can start making moves towards its first startup, which is very exciting. Now there's still quite a few things to sort out before we can do that, and what I'm hoping to tackle today is the colourful spaghetti, aka the wiring. Obviously having the electrics in place is absolutely crucial for things like getting spark to spark plugs and getting injectors to fire. So we're really going nowhere until at least the basics are in place. Now the wiring on an engine swap, whether it be an M50 or an M52, can be described as either a doddle or a nightmare depending on who you ask. Stick with me today and I'm going to explain what needs to be done and how I'm going to do it. But as a quick disclaimer, this is actually the first one I've ever done, so I'm figuring it out as I go as well. I have done quite a bit of research up to this point, and despite apprehension, I'm feeling just about ready to get stuck in with it really. But first things first, let me give you a bit of context on the build and explain what I got to work with. So the E30 in question here is actually a 316i manual that's a 1990 model, originally powered by an M40 4-cylinder engine, which is now sat in the corner, both literally and figuratively. And you'll notice there's a very shiny looking 24 valve engine now sat in the engine bay. More specifically, this is an M52 B28 2.8 litre straight 6, which I believe was originally from an E36, but is found in various other cars, but I think this one is from an E36. If you want to know more about how this M52 ended up in this engine bay, you'll want to check out the previous videos in the series. The wiring that you're looking at in the engine bay right now is actually the wiring that goes with the M40 engine. I've managed to leave it in place up to this point, well, the ECU side anyway, and I've just put this carrier back on since the previous video and just loosely rigged up the wiring back into its original position, just so I've got reference of where that went. The M52's wiring is in a bundle on the floor, so we'll get into that in just a minute. So now I've brought you up to speed on what the build actually is. It's time to talk about what is actually involved in wiring up a 24 valve swap into an E30. So effectively what I need to do is transplant this M52 wiring into the engine bay in place of that M40 wiring, which is currently mocked into place. In theory it should be pretty straightforward, but the problems begin with the plugs. Unfortunately, the E36 M52 plug will not simply connect up to the E30's plug. This is actually the plug in question that needs to be connected, and it's known as an X20. It's a 25 pin plug with a screw lock fitting. On the E30 side, the plug's called a C101, which I'll show you in a minute, which is a similar style 20 pin plug. Back on the E30 side, this is the C101 plug I was talking about, the 20 pin one. And it's in this carrier. I've already peeled back the shrouds on these just to get a look at what the wiring colours are, but effectively I need to take this away and replace it with something that connects to this. Getting this C101 plug and these wires connected to the M52's X20 plug is one thing, but knowing which wire goes to which wire on the M52's loom is another thing entirely. First of all, I should mention that there are off-the-shelf adapters which will connect between this C101 plug and the M52's X20 and go between them. If you get the correct adapter, then effectively you're sorted and you can just connect it up between the two looms. And hopefully that'd be the end of it. However, they are quite expensive for what they are, and they do add quite a bit of bulk to the wiring because you obviously end up with two connectors instead of one that sits in this holster nicely. But I will link to one of those in the description for you to check out if you are tempted by it. If you've been following along with this E30 build so far, you'll know I'm trying to do as much of this as I can myself really. There's definitely going to be things that I need to refer to the experts on and buy off the shelf parts, but where I can figure stuff out myself, I'm keen to do so and learn about it in the process. I'm feeling fairly confident I can splice these wires myself. Let's hope I don't eat my words on that. Another point is, with the cost of the off-the-shelf parts, I'm quite conscious because we're way over budget on this already, so I'm definitely game to save a few pounds where I can. One route I was considering to DIY this job was to quite simply make my own adapter, just like the ones you can buy off the shelves. If I could get the correct ends from a couple of scrap cars, it might not even be that expensive, but I am keen to try and do this with what I've got, and the adapter has the problem of the bulk, which I'd like to avoid if I can. So my current plan is to simply cut this end off the engine side of the M40's loom for this C101 male and splice it onto the M52's loom in place of the X20. If I do a good job of this, it might even look completely OE from the outside and even fit into its carrier. So now I've explained my plan with that, we can get on to looking at these wires and working out which one would need to connect to which. So I've already made two tables, one for the X20 and one for the C101, noting what the wire colour is and what the pin number is. And I've also spent some time doing some research to try and work out what each wire does on each harness respectively. It proved to be pretty tricky to do actually. There are a few pin-out tables online, but they don't completely agree with each other, and they don't completely agree with the reality of what I've actually got here. It's actually quite disconcerting not being able to find a nice table that just matches up perfectly with what I have. I'd be way more confident in doing this if I could find one. I can only assume the wiring on these vary quite a bit depending on the year and the model of the car, what equipment it came with, what market it was sold in, and whether they'd run out of grey wire in the factory on that day. To make the best of it, what I did was cross-reference multiple tables I found online to create my own. For example, if I found two or more sources saying C101 pin 7 green wire is for ignition switch and my pin 7 is also green, then I'll have high confidence in it being an ignition switch. So I can go ahead and connect it up to the X20 side ignition switch wire, which will hopefully have matched up with high confidence too. Long story short, I've made a mapping table for the C101 wires to the X20 wires as best I can. There are 25 pins on this X20 plug, but only 20 pins on the E30 C101. So there's going to be some redundant wires here. An E36 is a newer generation car, so there's going to be extra wiring for equipment that just isn't present or required here. You'd hope all the wires on this C101 side would actually match up to wires on this X20 side at the very least. But to be honest, there are one or two where I just can't be sure what the wire does so far. Those might have been redundant on the E30 from factory anyway. For example, I've got pin 20 red and yellow wire, and I found one source indicating that it'll be ABS related on the C101. And actually this car doesn't have ABS, and it never did, so maybe this is a wire that's just never been used. Knowing that's a possibility, and having matched up the vast majority of these, including all the most important ones, my plan now is to go ahead and solder up all the wires that I've got high confidence about. And once that's done, I can lay the new wiring in place in the engine bay and connect all the end connectors up. I'm hoping it might be obvious where the majority of different connectors go, because there's lots of different connector types and various wire lengths. So hopefully things will naturally want to sit where they belong. And once they're plugged in, I can trace the wires between the ends and the C101 and see if there's anything important missing. And if that fails, we'll find out what's not working when we try and actually start the engine. For example, if we're not getting a spark and we can trace that back from the relevant wires all the way to the C101 wires, we'll know if it's one of those redundant wires that's the problem. And with all that said, and I appreciate it's a hell of a lot to take in, I think it's probably about time we turned a spanner. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the E30's ECU and feed the big connector through the big rubber bung in the firewall. Let's get on with that. reign of the M40. Before I go ahead and chop connectors off these two wiring harnesses, I decided to crack out the soldering iron and just confirm that I can solder wires together. Now, I haven't done a lot of soldering wires, to be honest, so I thought it'd be good to do a few practice pieces, which I've done. Some went well, some didn't. My intention was to do the classic solder connection with a bit of flux, soldering iron, some solder, and a bit of black shrink wrap over the top just to make it all look neat and protected. To be honest, I've really impressed myself with how well I'm starting to be able to do these now after a few practice pieces. I mean, this is a video about M50, M52 wiring, so I'm not going to elaborate on how to solder in too much detail, but quite happy with what I was doing. Now, just at the point where I started to be confident with that, the old man reminded me about these solder connectors. He's been using these solder sleeve connectors for his bike wiring for a little while now and has started to swear by them, even defaulting to them rather than his old school soldering, which he would have been a big advocate of before. He tells me that they're much less fiddly to use and they're just as good. I've got a box of them and I have done a couple of test ones, and it's a little bit fiddly in its own way because you need to use the heat gun and you need to use the correct amount of heat to melt the solder but not burn the plastic sheathing. But I've kind of got the hang of this as well now and I'm really happy with the results. And with these two alongside each other, I think the obvious choice is to go with the solder sleeve connectors. It actually looks better. And if you've any doubts about the strength of these solder sleeve connectors, let me put you at ease, because I've given this a real good pull already and they're equally strong, these joints. My only worry really is that I've got a tight bunch of wires over there that need connecting together and I don't want to damage and burn them all while trying to get one of them soldered. So I'm going to have to be quite careful with that. And to be honest, that was a problem I had no matter which one I picked. And with my method decided upon, it's time to put the soldering iron away and get the wire cutters out, and we can pass the point of no return. So for clarification, this is the E30's C101 M40 engine harness, which I'm going to chop up probably around here, and I'm going to use this to splice onto this E36 M52 harness, having chopped off the X20. And this is my table of wiring that I keep referring to. So this is an amalgamation of my two tables to create one mapping table that maps the C101 pin and colour to the X20 pin and colour. Now, one thing I did notice after I'd made my two tables and worked out what was what and put these together is that most of the colours of the wires are actually consistent between the two harnesses, which was surprising to me because nobody else seems to have said that anywhere online. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not 100% confident about this table, but I have triple checked it against all the sources I found online, and this is as good as I'm going to be able to get it. I've spent quite a bit of time on this actually. We'll only know whether this is right or not later when we can see what's working and what's not in the car. I will come back and put any corrections in the description if there are any, so make sure you do check that out. The table's based on the 20 pins on the E30 C101 plug and which wire it corresponds to on the M52 harness. There are more wires on the X20. There's 25 as opposed to 20 on the C101. The redundant ones will hopefully be not important, and they'll be for things like climate control and cruise control, which aren't features on the E30. Without further ado, let's grab the cutters and let's liberate this C101 from its M40 harness. So now I've stripped the insulation off all the wires I'm going to join, and I'm going to work down my list joining them together. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to dip both ends in the flux, feed both ends into this solder connector, and then heat it up with the heat gun, being careful not to damage any of the other wires whilst I'm doing it. So I'm going to have to really be careful and take my time with it. Let's get the first one done and then we should be away. So pin 1 alternator charge to 25 alternator charge. Let's get them connected. Right, that took a bit of time, but it's gone incredibly well. I'm really confident with how well joined these connections are. There's only one thing really that's gone a little bit pear-shaped, and that's the green wire. You might be able to see, but on the X20 M52 side, there's two small green wires, and on the E30 C101 side, there's one large green wire. And I've decided to join all three. The trouble is, I'd forgotten there was two green wires on the X20 side. So when I cut the plug off, I had failed to note which one was pin 7 and which one was 21. I wanted to join 21 to this green, the larger green wire on the C101 side, because I had noted down that both of those were ignition, which is what it should be. We think 7 is actually for EWS, and I wasn't intending to connect it to anything. As I'm planning to be using an ECU with EWS mapped out of it, I think there's no harm in me just joining both of these up, safe in the knowledge that one of them is going to be the ignition, and hopefully the EWS one won't matter whether it's connected or not. If the worst comes to the worst, when this is in the car, I'll be able to trace these a bit better and work out which one I need to cut if I have a problem. But to be honest, I'm not expecting to have a problem. We'll see how that goes. So the next thing to do, before I start trying to tidy all this up and make it look factory, I want to get this loom into the car and get it fitted roughly into its position. The first thing I need to do will be remove some of this cowling, which is not going to help me at all, and feed through the ECU plug through the grommet into the cab. Never going to happen. So I've got the engine harness laid roughly in place now, and I can see where injector wiring goes, MAF wiring, alternator wiring and coil wiring. Everything else I'm kind of a bit unsure about. I can see the C101 plug is going to reach very comfortably, too comfortably, where it wants to go, and I've got quite a chaotic bundle of wires going on. Before I start just randomly trying to plug everything in, I am aware of this wiring bracket, which I believe lives on the side of the block somehow. Quite unclear at the moment, but I'm hoping to figure it out in just a second. Before I can fit that, I believe it goes above a spider pipe, which is for the coolant. So what I need to do is shift this wiring, fit the spider pipe, fit the bracket, and then hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. Let's do that. And before I forget, I'm going to fit this, which is the knock sensor, which fits onto two places on the block, here and over here. Right, so I'm going to start plugging in all the connectors, starting from the alternator, working my way back to the battery, or where the battery is going to live. And hopefully this will be quite easy to do, because a lot of the connectors are unique and are matched pairs. So I guess I'll try and plug everything in, and hopefully we don't have too many orphans. Right, so that's been going pretty well actually. I've got the wiring routed through this bracket, which is still looking quite messy, but a lot better than it was. And I found homes for almost every connector, which is great news. There's still a few things that aren't plugged in, such as the idle control valve and the throttle position sensor, because there's no intake manifold, so there's nowhere for them to plug in at the moment. And there are a couple of things that I'm not sure about at the moment. One of them being this strange extended cable, which is a blue and yellow and a green and white. Having looked at the wiring diagram, I'm still not clear what that one is, but hopefully all will be revealed. There's also a black with green stripe wire that looks like it's had the connector torn off it at some point. Hopefully that's not going to be anything too important, but we'll try and figure that one out too. And also these two connectors that aren't into anything are for lander sensors, and there's no lander sensors present at the moment, so that's to come. So the next thing to do is something quite important, which is a ground strap. I'm going to get the ground strap added in its OE position, and then we'll turn our attention towards the battery. I don't know why somebody had nicked the positive battery terminal off this M52 wiring loom, but I've just harvested the one off the E30's M40 wiring loom, and I've connected it very temporarily with this, just so that I can see that the car comes to life when I put the key in the ignition. I will be replacing this with a big chunky crimped connector, but I need to wait for them to get delivered in the post, so this will do for now. So that's the battery back in its old home with its new roommate. So before I go ahead and attach the negative terminal, I'm going to jump into the car and plug in the ECU. Now this is the ECU that actually came with this engine, and I have no idea if it's got EWS mapped out on it or anything like that, which is the immobilizer, which will stop this engine from doing anything if it's in place and you haven't got the other EWS parts rigged up properly, which we haven't. Now this one it's an MS41 DME, but it's not index 10 or index 11, which I believe it would need to be in order to be editable. It might be that somebody's opened this up and installed some kind of chip that removes EWS or similar to that. I'm not sure if that's possible. Equally, it might just be a totally standard ECU and not really of any use to me. I do have another one which has EWS removed and a bit of a different map on it, but I'm going to try this one first. There'll be a lot more to say about ECUs, to be honest, but I'll cover it in the future when the engine's a runner and when I understand it a little bit more myself. But for now, let's see if the car wakes up with this ECU in. So now I just need to connect on the negative terminal. Now I've got a little bit of trepidation about this because I'm worried that we're going to see some of these wires melting and billows of smoke, but there's only one way to find out really, and that's to stick it on. No smoke yet. Right, here we go. Let's see if the dash wakes up at least. Well, the wipers still work. Good signs of life on the dash. Let's go and check that wiring's not setting alight. Well, no smoke. Nothing feels like it's getting warm, which is a good sign. Good. Possibly ill-advised, but I can't help myself but want to blip the key and see if it'll crank over. Now there's a little bit of oil in there, so I don't think I'm going to do any damage, and I'm only going to very briefly blip it anyway. If it doesn't, it'll probably be down to the EWS more than anything, but we will check the connections. Now the fuel's not hooked up or anything like that, so there's no risk of it, you know, catching and starting and running or anything crazy like that. Imagine if it was that easy. But also the E30's fuel pump works on the crank, so it won't prime and spray fuel all over the room either, hopefully. So let's give it a blip, see what happens. I'm absolutely over the moon that the car will crank on the key. I actually was not expecting that at all, to be honest. Maybe the EWS prevents the spark rather than prevents the crank, but I'm not certain. Maybe you can let me know in the comments. Or maybe the EWS is actually removed from that ECU, which is unexpected. Now, the work we did with the C101 earlier, we won't know if it's fully successful until we actually try to fire the engine, which obviously can't happen at the moment because there's still a long way to go. But I need to do a lot of tidying up on this wiring and finish this job to a point where it looks a lot neater. To be honest, it's killing me not to want to invest time into tidying up this rat's nest and making it look way more presentable, but the fact of the matter is I might need to mess around with this a lot more yet, depending on the results of trying to start the car. I also need to find out what those two unknown wires do, so I'll have to do some research to figure that one out. Additionally, I need to remember to install a brown temp sensor into the head, and also wire it up somewhere. I need to figure that out too. If I don't do that, I won't have a temperature reading on the dash in the E30 because it uses a different style to the E36 one that it requires for the E36 ECU. The next thing I need to turn my attention to is the intake and the exhaust. So that's what the next couple of videos will be about, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. If you found what I've done with the wiring today helpful, maybe you're doing a similar build yourself and this has helped you out, make sure you give us a like. And thank you very much for watching.